Now I'm going to switch over to my laptop.
I'm gonna walk that road that we walked along before many years ago, and we'll walk 100 more. And we're coming one by one, you can see us 2 by 2. Every time we turn around, another's coming through, and we'll sing it long and proud, so everyone will know that the road to freedom is a long, long way to go.
Turn and look out over there. Just as far as you can see, there are many more who have died for liberty.
And we're coming one by one, you can see us 2 by 2. Every time we turn around, another's coming through, and we'll sing it long and proud, so everyone will know that the road to freedom is a long, long way to go.
Well, welcome back to Presbycast. You were on the long road to somewhere, and it brought you here. So for that, we will be thankful. It's good to be with you guys. We've already got a number of people, 12 people as of right now watching live. There are dozens of us. So it's always a good number to start with. We're trying to always stay, I guess, I don't know if current, dare I say relevant, but there's been a lot happening. So, and a lot of it is going to affect not only us as, correct Presbyterians, but pretty much everybody. So we've assembled a number of correct believing Presbyterians to discuss things tonight, especially...
Well, now Carrie is a former Presbyterian. I think she could be a Lutheran now. Let me. I want to correct this quickly. Is that correct, Carrie?
No, I'm not officially a Lutheran. My children have become Lutheran. They were confirmed, but I am not a communicant member. I'm still a confessing Westminsterian. So,
Resby was right, and you're
50% of the time I'm right every time.
And you're sort of a fugitive from ecclesial justice, like Resby used to be.
Oh, there we go.
That's all good.
And unfortunately, the last time Carrie was on the show, I forget why I couldn't be. So Chris Drew had filled in. So it's a pleasure to.
You were in jail, I think, weren't you in jail?
Yeah, I was. Topher was trying to come and bail me out, but it's awful hard to pay a bail bond and an empty gift card. So.
Well, it's true, and but we're glad that Carrie is with us. She's a mover and a shaker in the Christian Libertarian movement, and one of her good friends, Gregory Baus, is with us. And let's see, did you connect this time, Greg? Not hearing him at the moment. Maybe he'll get connected. When he does join in with us, I'll remind some. He probably doesn't know, but I remember his name from 10 years ago on various blogs and that sort of thing. He's a long timer in the Reformed blogosphere, but he'll join us shortly. Also got our friend Free XJC, who's something of a libertarian. You can tell by looking at him, he's that kind of libertarian. You can look at Carrie and you think she's not that kind of libertarian. But it's all good. Greg will be with us. Gregory will be with us shortly. So we've done a lot of shows about COVID, and I really hoped we wouldn't do any more. And are you with us, Greg? Oh, let me unmute.
Hear me now?
There you go.
Coming through my mic.
Yes, I think you're good. So I was telling them that I remember you from as many as 10 years ago on the Reformed blogosphere, Reformed Outhouse, maybe Greenbag in his old life. You've been around, so maybe that'll spur some memories. for folks.
Yes.
But I sort of rediscovered.
I'm a famous friend of Daryl Hart.
Okay, well, you're sort of an international man of mystery. I think you can tell us later all the places you've been. But yeah, an interesting character. So, Carrie, we've got the little graphic of Machen with a mask on down in the corner. I really hoped we had used that for the last time a few months ago. We've done a lot of shows on COVID and the lockdowns and church response to these things. Even next week, Gary, we're going to have those guys from England and Scotland on, who are petitioning the Prime Minister not to include them in the vaccine passport program. So that'll be next Monday morning. But we're back in it. This fall and winter are going to be as divisive and difficult as the last one. So, Carrie, tell us. What's the last year meant for you, and how do you think the various factions have handled it?
Wow, such a broad question. I mean, 2020, I think, has really brought out and highlighted a lot of problems that already existed before COVID, I would say. They were just under the surface and easily ignored, and now they are not so easily ignored. And I'd say, some of those probably have to do with, questions about the proper role of government, questions about the proper use of law, man's law, specifically civil law. And, even questions about the nature of the relationship between church and state. Can the state overrule the church? Should the church submit even when the government is telling them to do something that they know they're not supposed to do before God? I think a lot of those questions have come up, and I think as far as factions are concerned, I don't think it's cleanly split between two sides. We have a tendency to do exactly that because we have our, two-party system. We have this left-right paradigm. But I would say that there's probably at least 3, if not more, sort of factions, probably more factions, people who, lean towards, not having mandates, but maybe voluntarily going along with some of these restrictions because it sounds good. You've obviously got the really polarized factions on both sides. I don't think it's off color for me to say that Doug Wilson made some really big noise last year with political resistance, and there were plenty of Reformed Christians who rebuffed him for that. And I almost want to say lumped in to his camp a number of us who were saying, hey, these are red flags. We should be paying attention to this and resisting this. And so there was a lot of oversimplification. There was a lot of scapegoating, things like that going on. And I think it's just creating a cause for confusion, which I'd say that the people in power they absolutely want that to be the case. They want us to be confused. They want us to be divided. They want us to be, fundamentally off our balance. And to some degree, we are, I would say, or we're only going to find our balance once again when we start talking about this and having civil discussions about it and listening to, all points of concern. And that's going to require, slowing down and taking a deep breath and being willing to listen. So I don't know. That's how I see it.
Well, one of the, I listen to sort of mainstream libertarians like, or sort of popular Mises types like Dave Smith, Tom Woods, sometimes Bob Murphy. A couple of those guys aren't the most exciting characters in the world, but nevertheless, but one of the things they say is that the libertarians, such as they are in this country, or the Libertarian Party establishment, really whiffed on the lockdowns. They didn't use it as an issue, and they didn't come out clearly on it. That they lost their nerve, and that, or maybe they didn't know what they believed or ought to do. And we can sort of understand that. Nobody knew exactly what to do. But I think if the response to COVID revealed problems with society and politics, it revealed them even in the libertarian movement. And I'm sure even your sort of Christian libertarian group maybe didn't agree on everything, every response. But let's talk about the libertarians before we talk about whether there even should be such a thing or there can be Christian libertarians. Let's talk about how the libertarians in general handled 2020.
Well, sure. I mean, I think most philosophical libertarians, especially the Misesian guys, Rothbardian guys, will insist on the distinction between philosophical libertarians and the Libertarian Party. If anybody has been paying attention to the politics of the Libertarian Party in the last year especially, but it's been going on for a lot longer, is this, there's a divide in the Libertarian Party, which I don't quite understand, except that it's a difference between ideology and pragmatism. And so the pragmatists are sort of in power, or at least they were in power. I don't know to what end the ideologues have made their way in. Those are more the Misesian guys. But, there's a very serious question about whether or not pragmatism is the best way forward, or pushing ideology and being firm in our principles. And so when it came to the Libertarian Party and calling people out, there was actually, there were state parties who were calling things, I'd say, correctly. They were raising all these red flags. But even the National Party would shoot them down, and like it turned into this nasty infighting. And so at any rate, for what it's worth, I mean, I'm not even a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, well, that was a question I had for you, because there's a difference between people who hold libertarian principles and people who are party members.
Right. Yeah. And I've never been a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party. I've only been a philosophical libertarian. And so, yeah, I think it's entirely possible for somebody to hold to consistent libertarian principles, consistent Christian principles, and disagree with the Libertarian Party.
All right. Well, that's helpful, and we may talk more about that. But we have a lot to talk about. I think one of the things I want to go ahead and ask on the day that California basically said you have to show your vaccine papers to go to a restaurant or a health club or a bar, and who knows if churches will get pulled up in that dragnet or not. Any event of more than 1,000 people. On that day, the day that this is, of course, nobody noticed when New York did it, because we knew that, well, they're New York. But San Francisco has issued this today, and you've got to have both shots or be fully vaccinated, not just have one of the two, for the 2 out of 3 vaccines that require 2. And the responses to the news from a lot of people has been cheering and saying, "Well, thanks for doing this. This is what you should have done." What has 2020 told you or taught you about the willingness of people to come under these draconian restrictions.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, I think
I've been sort of disappointed.
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think there's a little bit of an availability bias there, because in the circles that I'm in, I don't watch mainstream news anymore. I have not owned a television set since 2008 when the digital switch happened, and so in my circles, I don't see the cheering so much in my face. I have to intentionally go out. And so I'm not entirely certain that I would say that the majority of people are cheering these vaccine passports. I do think that the media is intentionally trying to make it as though the majority popular opinion is that we need the vaccine passports. And there are certainly, people on social media who are cheering them. I was actually watching a video the other day about the concept of mass psychosis, and how that happens, the pattern and how that is created, and it's created through fear. It's created through isolating people, taking away all your options, making life absolutely miserable, and then dangling a carrot back in front of you and saying, look, you can have all of this back if you do what I tell you to do. And so, why do people actually capitulate to that? Well, because they're trying to get back to normal, right? And that's actually, just from a human perspective, that's not an abnormal thing to want to, get back to normal. And so I wouldn't deride the cheering reaction as being anything other than an expression of this mass psychosis. You have a lot of people who really do just want to get back to normal, and they think that this one thing will do it. They don't understand that fully vaccinated may mean two shots now, but in 6 months, it's going to be none of you are fully vaccinated anymore because you need the booster, right?
Yeah, it feels like stepping onto a carousel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in one respect, I would say, I think there's room if we're willing to understand the psychology of what's happening. I think there's room to have some grace for people, just normal everyday people who are getting wrapped up in this, and maintain our focus on the problem, the major problem, which is the state and the media, who is being their propaganda arm.
Well, I think we can, and cutting back to San Francisco, I forget who it was on Twitter, but I didn't write this, and I'll PG-ify it. But San Francisco becomes the only city where you can literally walk through human excrement on the sidewalk, only to have to, prove your vaccination to enter a restaurant. So we are. If ever was a city that could represent peak Twitter, I feel like it has to be San Francisco right now.
Right.
Well, and they've also stopped prosecuting property crimes below a certain amount. So, I've heard many accounts of people that just run into Walgreens and get as much as they can carry and then run out. So I wonder, this really could cut down on the theft and the petty crime, because if you have to show your vaccine passport before you go steal something, that could really be helpful.
It's going to be a whole lot of vaccines with the name Fuzzy Dunlop written on them.
All right, let's see if Baus, are you back with us? Our other professional, almost libertarian. All right. Are you with us there, Greg?
Yeah.
You said you had
sorry about the. Well, I was going to say sorry about the connection problems. Where we have a lightning storm coming through the valley here, so it's been acting up. But anyway.
Well.
I missed most of what Carrie said, but I can just guess. I can guess what she said.
Yeah, completing your sentences, are you?
Yeah. No. Give me a what am I supposed to say now?
Well, it's something very intelligent and thoughtful, of course. Um, well, let's jump into the whole concept of freedom. I think it's almost a dirty word. And this is for you and Carrie. It's almost a dirty word now. Individual rights and freedom. Freedom is thought to be a selfish concept, and surely. Those of us who grew up evangelicals, we know that it was too individualistic. It was too much about experience, and of course, with the prosperity gospel, it's become about individual attainment or what you can get, and greed. But there's been an overcorrection to where any talk of individual anything is frowned upon, and we've become. We talk about community, and community is a huge concept, and it should be in the church, but it's almost become a sort of collectivism, sort of an idealistic thing that I'm not sure can bear everything that we put on it. So, Carrie, have you noted this overreaction against anything connected with individual freedom in the church? Of course, we would expect it from leftists of a certain kind, and from what we would call political liberals. But even in the church, talk of individualism is frowned upon.
Yeah, well, my response to the whole, individualism and freedom thing has been to say, look, the Christian perspective is neither individualistic nor collectivistic. It can't be either. We are individuals, but we live in community. So, as far as freedom is concerned, we have scripture that talks about our freedom. We have in Reformed circles, we have our confessions that talk about Christian liberty and freedom of conscience. These are longstanding doctrines that we've had, and of course, none of that is to say you can use your Christian liberty to sin against another person. But what I see from people, especially Christians who want to appeal to the community, in the sense of, well, you owe the community something, you owe the community getting this vaccination or whatever it is, putting a mask on, social distancing, staying home, what have you. When we're talking about those requirements, they're usually talking about it in the context of love. This is the loving thing to do. And my response to that is to say, look, wearing masks and, getting a vaccination is not a universal expression of love. God didn't say that. And aside from that is the question of, what about the risks to me? This a lot of people talk about this vaccine as though it's an absolute good, which borders on idolatry, right? Worshiping the created rather than the creator. But so there's questions about what Christian love is. I just did an episode on that for my podcast. There's questions about
give us the name of that before we forget.
Sure. The title of the episode is just "What is Christian Love?" and it's on the Dare to Think podcast.
Okay, the Dare to Think, not the.
Yeah.
Are you still doing Mere Liberty?
Yeah, Dare to Think is the official podcast of MereLiberty.com. So you can just go to Mere Liberty and search "What is Christian Love?" and you'll get the episode.
Okay.
So we're talking about. We have to raise these questions about, okay, what is Christian love? What is Christian liberty? What is the Christian view of the state and the Christian view of the role of civil governance? But I think fundamentally what it comes down to, and we've had the left-right paradigm swing, in America for decades now. And the one thing that I've concluded or at least the thing that I observe about how Christians treat civil governance is that they treat the law, they treat civil law as something that is supposed to coerce obedience and compliance to the two greatest commandments. So conservatives tend to use the law in order to coerce love of God, and we see this in terms of laws that for marriage licenses to protect the sanctity of marriage and things like that, or laws allowing prayer in school or what have you. But then the other side of that is that we have a tendency to, or Christians have a tendency to use the civil law to try to compel compliance to the second greatest commandment, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves. And that's what you have going on right now with, these emotional appeals to why you should wear a mask even if you don't want to, or why you should get a vaccine even if you don't want to. It is not a universal expression of love to just go out and get a vaccine or go put on a mask. There are good reasons why people would do neither. And it can't be said that choosing to do neither is not an expression of love. Now, I would say, and I'm not without sympathy. My parents are both vulnerable to these sorts of infections. My dad in particular has COPD. And so we have to take extra care when we're sick anyways. But my making a choice, right, to distance from my dad or wear a mask around my dad or make these choices is certainly an expression of love towards him. Maybe part of that expression is just staying away, taking time to stay away. Maybe that's the best way that I can express that while I'm not feeling well. So it's just not the case that we have universal expressions of love. We can't deny the individual in favor of the community. We have to consider that they both exist, and we can't reduce one to the other.
Yeah, well, and I think when I think about loving our neighbors, they've got to be able to make a living, and lockdowns that are that kill small business and preserve big business. It doesn't seem like neighbor love to me.
Right.
It just doesn't. It just doesn't. And people say, well, that's materialistic, or you're only worried about money. Most of my friends have been able to work through all this, and they're fine. But there are a lot of people that's just not been the case for. A lot of people were on the edge anyway. We know that drug overdoses and spousal abuse, all that stuff has gone up. There are side effects, not just to vaccines. There are long-term effects, not just to the virus, but certainly the lockdown is toxic in its own way, and in many ways. And I think when I think about the neighbor love issue, that's not just an inconvenience like a mask. That's a really, really big deal to me.
Yeah.
I'm still not totally certain. Like, at least the vibe in my area is I'm not sure that people will do it again in terms of locking down. And I can think of a few places that almost certainly won't. Little restaurants, mom and pop diners, places who may or may not have opened for indoor dining even before they were permitted to. And I think there's like a weird connection with with how people look at things. Like, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I almost pine for the days when we were debating whether or not Jill Biden should be called doctor. That seemed like such a more sane time. And I think I said it on here, I don't remember, but the thing about that was whether or not Jill Biden wants to be called doctor is of no consequence. But the real thing that everyone was missing is that it's only EdDs who asked to be called doctors. PhDs just want you just want you to call them Frank or Barbara or whatever their name is. But every Ed D is like, no, I'm doctor. And so I think when we, kind of move that over to lockdowns is people is like, you have to do it this way because this is what we're entitled to, not a matter of, looking and there's some, kind of, nuance and, good reasons why a person should. If you want to get vaccinated, go do it. Mm-hmm. You should. You absolutely should. There's no sin in doing it. If it's your choice and you're not being coerced, go do it.
Yeah.
If you don't, that's also just as a legitimate choice. And we've never. What's always struck me with these like mandates is the way, is really the marketing. And I was sort of like an advertising centered major in college, so I always have that, dare I say, hermeneutic when looking at things. Is the way that this is for other people, but then we're doing this for everyone so that we can get back to normal. But you would never run an HPV vaccine commercial the same way. And I know it's not apples to apples, but you look at it as like, protect yourself, like do this. And we've never seen that in like the COVID vaccination things. It's, I hate to say grandma killer, but like, that's a tough, I don't know how you break people of that marketing because it's so entrenched now. Yeah. And as Orwell once wrote, only the proles are free.
Well, right. I heard it declared on I think it was on a James Dellingpole podcast. His guest who had trained in hypnotism, and he said people have been hypnotized by the messaging, and that may be true to some extent. Well, before we go ahead.
Can I just say a couple of things on that?
Sure.
First of all, and I wrote an article at the Libertarian Christian Institute last year called "The Virulence of Moral Panic," and moral panic is a phenomenon of hyping everybody up in order to create this frenzy and get behavior to change. And
that's what our Twitter feed is.
Yeah, there you go. So, but the thing about this, and I truly believe this is a moral panic. But the thing about this one is that the fear that they are exploiting is the natural human fear of viruses and pathogens, which human beings have a very base fear of this, because viruses and pathogens can legitimately wipe out, great swaths of populations. And so we do have a very base fear of this. When it comes to talking about, though, or breaking that marketing message, like you were talking about, the way I talk about this is you don't have to be anti-vax or pro-vax or anything like that. That's not the issue, right? I'm not anti-vax. I would like to see vaccine manufacturing being left to the free market, where not only can it go through the steps to actually produce a safe and effective vaccine, and that competition between manufacturers creates an incentive to do so, but also the consumer is the best regulator of the free market. And when they choose not to buy, they are sending you a signal. They're saying, no, this is not something that I'm willing to put my money on. But not only that, but that resistance should be queuing up researchers to create diagnostics to see if you're particularly vulnerable to vaccine injury or these other risks. And creating alternatives to vaccines that would produce the effect that we want, which is communal immunity, right? This herd immunity effect. It is not the case that just vaccines are going to do this. And I think it's really weird that the marketing that we're hearing is the only cure is the vaccine. And that's simply not the case. It might be good for some people, and that's fine. But it's not good for everybody. There's no medical procedure that is good for everybody. And if this was left to the free market, there would be less fear. There would be more options. There would be diagnostics to make sure that things were safe and effective. And we would be more likely to actually beat this thing than with the state clamping down and striking fear in the hearts of people.
Yeah, I mean, if you make a good and safe vaccine, people are going to line up to take it.
Sure.
And we had the weird thing this time that what was in the fall and summer of 2020, you had Democrats saying, "I'm not going to take this. It's the Trump vaccine."
Kamala Harris is literally on record into a microphone as saying it.
Yeah, I hear it about once a week on No Agenda. They play it at least one show a week. But now it's sort of the Democrat vaccine. So there are people who aren't going to take it because of that. But I'm sorry, I've actually had a cough for 5 weeks. So if I halt, it's because I don't have COVID. I was actually tested, but I got something else.
Have you tried cigarettes?
there are other diseases.
They're guaranteed to kill anything in your lungs.
Yeah, there are other diseases in the world. I'm informed. So yes, we're not anti-vax. We are pro freedom to take it if you need it. And some people just don't have a choice. I know of a nurse who's going to leave a hospital because she's being mandated. There was word a few months ago that there are a lot of medical professionals, including nurses, that haven't taken it. Now, whether that's because they've all had it and they think their natural immunity is fine, or if it's because they know something based on what they see. I know other nurses who are mad at mad at people who haven't been vaccinated because they blame them for filling up their wards. So what do you do?
Yeah, I mean it's sort of there's I've said it on our kind of message board a little bit, like in the same way you can, like, the weather outside is weather, is sort of like one of those frustrated, like, whatever's going on, but it's like cases are rising because cases are rising. It kind of like what we're going back to with the marketing, like there's an intentional like moving of the goalposts against the way that it, like, the number of cases is completely decoupled from a rise in deaths, which is incredibly good news. Like, as the resident sports handicapper on this podcast, like, COVID still isn't even close to covering the spread. Like, it's going way, way under. And I think, I forget where I saw it, but it's like, look, if you told somebody, like, you're going to go to war, you're going to suffer 500,000 casualties, deaths. You come back and only 100,000 people died. It doesn't make the 100,000 who died any less sad, but that is an incredible military success. I mean, and so it's just, and it's always been, how do we do both and rather than like either or, and we've lost the ability to see both of those things.
Yeah, I think I would say that the people who are clamoring for mandatory vaccinations would say the same thing for vaccinations. They'd say, look, we're going to have some losses. Mm-hmm. And the reality is that no matter how you slice it, there's a risk involved. Now, that risk is variable, depending on who it is that we're talking about. If I'm talking about my dad, I'm talking about somebody who has a greater risk. If I'm talking about myself or my kids, I'm talking about somebody who has a lower risk. But only the individual is the one who knows their bodies the best and whether or not that risk is worth taking. Mm-hmm. And so I may be willing to risk contracting COVID. And, we might roll the dice and find out that kills me, right? But who's to say that if I took the risk in getting the vaccine, that wouldn't have also killed me? The point is that I'm the one who's bearing all the burden, especially since we can't, you can't sue any of the vaccine manufacturers. And I just want to point out that this isn't like an exception to the rule, right? We found out that none of the manufacturers for the COVID vaccine were going to have to worry about liability. They couldn't get sued. This has been a longstanding law for all childhood vaccinations. You cannot sue for liability for any vaccine injury. And so when the individual is bearing all that burden, and there's no relief if if the worst happens and they're injured one way or the other, then the person who should be able to make that decision is not the person who doesn't get to bear the responsibility or bear the burden of that risk actually manifesting. If I'm taking on the burden, I get to make that decision. And this isn't this isn't to say, oh, I don't love you if I don't want to take on this risk. No, you would do the same thing. You would do the same thing. So,
well, it kind of works like, because I completely agree, and I'm not actually going to disagree with you, even if it sounds like it, but like that also works in the like. I think that's how you know that some of this stuff, and maybe this is a little tinfoily, but this is a safe space to wear a tinfoil hat. Is already it was like if I went to a restaurant and got food poisoning, I can't sue them for it. Like I'm like those places are already protected from being sued based on something I might contract while I'm in their space. So, in 2019, if I went to a concert and got sick because I sat next to somebody with the flu, the promoter is not liable for that. No. So I think that's what's like it's not a liability thing that's being put in place because it was already there. And so the fact that, it just adds this other layer of like very stupid intrigue that we now all have to wade through to do seemingly basic stuff.
Right. Well, and for the Christian in particular, I would say, look, if you're so focused on the vaccine and the vaccine is the thing that you believe is necessary, like, are you saying that God somehow didn't take into account viruses? I mean, he gave us an immune system, which is, I hate to use the word, co-evolved with pathogens in order for us to adapt and survive. And that's what it's there for. God gave us an immune system to fight off disease. It is not a given that we have a fundamental right to not be exposed to pathogens. We're exposed to pathogens all the time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, let's open up for questions to our Libertarian friend, Free XJC first. Let's see how his sound is working there. Free, we got a little feedback with you. I've got your echo canceled now.
Okay.
And my friend Bouse, he's had a storm come through and lives in the middle of nowhere and has what we call the old Resby internet, so he may not be back with us. But Free XJC, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I think I might take this in just a slightly different direction and think about it from the aspect of the church. And last year we had, at least for a time, the state telling the church what we can and cannot do in our worship services. Of course, in hindsight, we can see this as an overreach, and we were attending services via Zoom or streaming or whatever, but there are things that we could not do that the Lord has commanded us to do, such as partake in the Lord's Supper. So, when we think about this prospect of going back into lockdown, what are we going to allow the state to fence the table again? And I think that's a very important question that we need to ponder. Just open that up for you guys to talk about.
So it's sort of the question of resistance and civil disobedience and the limits of state power. Carrie, I figure you have some thoughts about that. Our friend Baus, who's not with us anymore, he sent me a bibliography on the sort of the Reformed and Christian doctrine of resistance and the theology thereof. But I mean, we also have to recognize that, and libertarians would appreciate this, the federalism of all this, the fact that every state and every community is not under the same standards. So some of our listeners will have all sorts of freedom, and some will have almost none. And that's irksome to us. And because we love our neighbor, we're concerned about that. So recognizing there's going to be a variety, how would you counsel church officers and pastors and members make the decision whether to get in the car and whether to obey, whether to show up, whether to meet outside of normal venues? What would you say to them as a Christian with libertarian principles?
Well, I would say you can't serve two masters, and God hasn't given church officers the power to keep people from word and sacrament because they're sick. I mean, if anything, what we see in Scripture is that the people that we are supposed to be preaching to are the sick, the poor, the widowed. I mean, it's everybody, right? But Christ was reaching out and touching lepers.
Yeah, let me jump in. One of the guys I'm going to have on Monday morning, Paul Levy, he's a pastor of the Ealing Presbyterian Church. That's south of London, I think, and very bright guy. And I immediately liked him when I heard him say that, the people that come to our church, they're kind of weirdos and misfits and all that sort of thing. And he says, they are affected unusually, to an unusual degree, by isolation and by not being able to worship, and by what the government imposes on them. And he said, and of course I like to say there's no weird like Reformed weird, and we often make fun of all the weirdos in our churches, mostly OPC, but not exclusively. And so that that's a good point. That's kind of what you said. We're ministering to people that are physically vulnerable, and we need to think about that. But
right.
People aren't just a body. I mean, we aren't Marxists. We aren't materialists.
Right.
We are about the spiritual here.
Right. Well, and there was a report that came out, and I just sort of glanced through it, but there was a report that came out talking about comorbidities of people who were dying with COVID over the past 18 months. And one of the top comorbidities was paranoia, which is this fear that has been induced, this mass psychosis that has been induced through politicians and the media, and that paranoia, that fear, is facilitated by isolation. Like, there is a reason. There are very real reasons, not just spiritual, abstract, ethereal reasons why the church gathers. There are very real, practical reasons why we are called to fellowship. We are, and point for those Christians who want to talk about community, right? There is a reason why the church gathers together. There is a reason why there is, why Scripture doesn't make distinctions between, rich Christians and poor Christians, and male Christians and women Christians, and all of this. We are all one body, and so we can't reduce the body of Christ. We can't reduce humanity even down to infection vectors. No, we're image bearers of God, and God gave us an immune system. And God did not give church officers the authority to bar people from word and sacrament just because they have an infection. Now, does that mean that, if you've got 104-degree fever and it's not coming out your nose and, hacking up all over the place, that you should go to church? Well, probably not. But this is a matter of Christian conscience and Christian liberty, and saying, look, there are reasonable times where it's okay for you to stay home from church, right? But you have to make those decisions yourself. I've never seen a situation where somebody just shows up and they're hot-headed and feverish and, have all of these crazy symptoms. Like, who actually wants to go out when they're feeling like that? Humans have a natural propensity to self-preserve. So I don't think that we would have this situation where, pastors are having to fight off sicklies at the door. But at the same time, this notion that everybody is a potential infection vector because they're, this asymptomatic spread, and that's what we need to be afraid of. God created us with an immune system, and it's a pretty dang good immune system. That doesn't mean it doesn't need help. That doesn't mean it doesn't, need any of those other things. But it is not the role of church officers to bar people from word and sacrament because they're sick.
Yeah, and we should, we shouldn't lean on people who are scared about coming back, knowing about all and we, at my church, that's like no one. I mean, the people who aren't coming to church now are people who weren't coming to church 2 years ago, more or less. But you shouldn't pressure people to come back before they want to, but you shouldn't keep people from gathering unreasonably. Now, it's not to say that in April of 2020, when we didn't know what was going on, that we shouldn't have gone online for a couple of weeks or a month or 6 weeks, but we should have been doing everything we can to the point of multiple services and great inconvenience to the ministers and the officers to make it work somehow.
Well, and, I think there should also be, and I don't know to what degree this has been the case because it has not been my experience, but those people who favored mask mandates and lockdowns and all of this stuff, what they would say is that they had been ridiculed by Christians who opposed it. And so I think, if you are showing up to church and you don't believe in wearing masks, or you don't feel like you don't need to wear a mask or whatnot, there's no reason to ridicule your neighbor who walks in wearing a mask. Like, that's part of their Christian liberty. There's no reason to ridicule your Christian neighbor for choosing to get the vaccine, right? They took a risk assessment. They decided that it was worth taking it. Then that's what you're free to do. There's no need for us to be ridiculing each other for our personal decisions that maybe we wouldn't have made for ourselves.
Yeah, and my session, basically we never required anything absolutely. I mean, we recommended things, but we never had 100% compliance, and no one was in trouble or chastised or anything like that if they didn't comply 100%. So, church officers are to lead, not to compel and strike with the rod unless it's just absolutely necessary.
Well,
Go ahead, Resby.
I was going to say, if we could go back to kind of Carrie's earlier point about paranoia and isolation, anyone go on, YouTube, or I guess if you still have MSNBC, if they still show Lock Up, late at night after their main stuff is going on, that was always a great thing to fall asleep to. It's just an endless episode of prison documentaries. But like, if you go watch any documentary on, let's say, Supermax in Colorado, where they're keeping, the Unabomber, Eric Rudolph, like these really heinous, evil guys, they talk about the harshest part of it is just the isolation, the separation from other people.
Yeah.
There's just 23 hours a day, just seeing the same four walls in there. So it's no wonder, when people come out of there and they're weird or not right, that's not a bug. That's a feature. Like it's designed to just wreck you. So all of a sudden, when we have people who are, who have stayed in their house, who are still, Clorox wiping their oranges as they get them delivered, and maybe that's unfair. Maybe there aren't actually people doing that, but it's like, yeah, it like these people are acting weird because that's what was always going to happen. That doesn't make it any less sad. It doesn't mean that sometimes the fiercest weapon against something like that isn't to just say like, you're being a goober, stop doing this.
Right.
But we shouldn't be surprised when people are just like, they can't see the world in front of them because they can only see, the world that they've been shown for so long.
Right. So I want to say two things. One, before we get too far afield from the question of the relationship between church and state, there's a document that Gregory and I worked on together. We put together a document both for Reformed Libertarianism, the Facebook group, and for our group, Reformed Anarchism, where we work out in detail the theology and philosophy behind this. How do we take these things into proper context with scripture, and also views of civil governance and things like that. And so I just want to point that out for anybody who's really interested in getting into the details of that, and what, because we're not just shooting from the hip. We have thought through this very deeply. And so I don't know if we can put up that link in some way. Maybe I can give that to you at the end. But the other thing that I want to point out, and talk about what Resby is talking about here with the paranoia and the isolation. There was a documentary that I saw several weeks ago now. It's called The Wisdom of Trauma, and I have a review of that up on my website. And it's not a Christian take, but he is talking about a lot of these things that are affecting us. Things like, how isolation actually creates trauma. How and it doesn't take. Well, let me just read this quote, because this was from my review. So this documentary was mostly about the work of a doctor named Dr. Gabor Mate. And he says this, he says, to get traumatized, first of all, trauma is something that happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. So abuse isn't trauma, neglect isn't trauma, but those two things can cause trauma. But he says, they get traumatized, children specifically, and I think they would say this is true of adults as well. People get traumatized because they're alone with their hurt. It's not because they get hurt that they get traumatized. It's because they're left alone with their hurt. He says, quote, "You don't need all the privations of war, racism, abuse, and violence for trauma to occur. Just parents alienated from their own gut feelings in such a way that they would let their infants cry when that child is desperate for a relationship." And that is true, I would say, of human beings generally. We are relational creatures. God created us to be that way. And when we're talking about this question of, do we isolate unvaccinated people because we're afraid of them? No, that's terrible. That's terrorizing. And it creates trauma. It just makes the problem worse. So at some point we have to accept the fact of the reality that pathogens exist. We have to coexist with them, but God took that into account. He's no dummy. He already figured this out. This is why we have immune systems. And it is imperative that we don't isolate people. We don't create a caste system because people make choices that we don't like. None of those things are Christian values.
All right, we've got one of our friends. He's a PCA pastor, small church. Let's see if we can get him in. And his actual first name is Job. So he's one of the more biblical guys that we know. But Job, do you have any questions, observations, perspectives as a local church pastor in a fairly free state, I guess?
Yeah, in Georgia. Well, my first thought is we've not promoted masks. We've not spoken too highly of vaccines. The phrase reformed anarchism is used. So this video will possibly never see the light of day on Google and YouTube. So let's just keep that in mind. But I keep.
That means you can say whatever you want, dude.
Yeah, that's the point. What do we do with that? As I was thinking about it, to me, it's a consideration here is for the church is where do you get your liberties? And I think oftentimes for Christians in our country, it's that God is the one. God gives us liberty and freedom. But I think oftentimes we think that God essentially has said to the state, to the government, you have right now to decide what their liberty will be. And that's why a lot of times Christians are so willing to give up liberties, because we've not yet understood that it's God who makes us free.
Right.
And thus we look to the state or we look to other things to tell us. It's almost as if he handed over the keys and said, here's freedom. Now decide how they're going to have it. And so we're quick to let it go and let it go away. And you mix that in with oftentimes a law of just generally of moral legislation. American evangelicals really love moral legislation. You grow up being told you can watch G movies and not PG-13. You can, you spend a lot of time boycotting and doing all kinds of things. And you grow up thinking and being reared to value moral legislation. And you combine that often with the thought of that there's a mixture of what is the kingdom of God or a mixture of what is the calling that all have in between the society and the church. And it gets mixed up together. And so mandates can go all kinds of ways from all kinds of people, and we get confused. And that's right opportunity for those who know that about Christians. I mean, the amount of money that's probably been made off of webcasting and Christian apps and things to keep this going and is probably just would be somewhat shocking, I bet, if we looked into it, just like the vaccine money being spent. Is that there's a lot of people that have made a lot of money off churches being offline and having digital services and being essentially a take your pick, online or in-person church. It's been really complicated. So yes, I think as Carrie said, ministers, we don't have the right to declare you can or cannot within the context of, we know discipline and all that. But as she said, she was correct. But it does start with who gives us freedom, who makes us free. And God is the one who gives liberty.
I've heard some ridiculous arguments. This is from guys I would call progressives in my own denomination. And they said, well, do you ban smoking in your church building? Do you require people to wear clothes? Things like that.
We should very much allow smoking in church.
We should encourage smoking.
I made the point that if you look at pictures of old churches, even Reformed churches like the Huguenots, you'll see spittoons, you'll see guys carrying swords, you'll see dogs, things have changed a bit, and things are can be cultural, but I don't think banning smoking is exactly the same thing as requiring this or that. So,
well, neither is wearing clothes. I want to add, like, the government doesn't actually mandate me to wear clothes. I choose to wear clothes because that's just that's what we do.
These things are self-evident.
Yes, It is.
It's love of neighbor in my case.
Well, and but even so, not only am I choosing to wear clothes, I'm choosing what I put on my body, right? Nobody's telling me that I need to do this. But to Job's point, too, just to plug libertarianism again, this is why libertarianism is so helpful in this area, because we draw this distinction between what should be considered legal or illegal versus what is moral and immoral. And I think that, if somebody wants to make the case that not wearing a mask is immoral, fine. Let's have that out. Let's have that as a conversation. But just because, and let's just say for the sake of argument that it is immoral, just because it's immoral doesn't necessarily mean that we need the government using force, using legal violence in order to make sure that you wear a mask. The question of legality is a separate issue from morality. And certainly rights violations, which we would say are violations of self-ownership. That's and that happens when you initiate violence against another human being or force or coercion. That's a rights violation. That's the proper realm for civil governance, and Scripture bears that out. But Scripture doesn't say that the state needs to be deciding whether or not women are wearing head coverings in church, or, whether or not we have a common cup at the altar or little plastic, individual serving cups or whatever. Those are all issues that, may have a moral element to it, but they're also questions that are left to individual congregations, individual people, that sort of thing. There's context for it. And at least insofar as the question of the state is concerned, we're talking about what are we going to allow the state to kill somebody over? Are we really going to allow the state to kill somebody for not wearing a mask? Are we really going to allow the state to kill somebody for not getting a vaccine? That seems completely counterintuitive. We want to save your life. You're not doing what we told you to save your life. So, we're going to lock you up and take away the key so that you can't live your life.
Yeah, I think people should probably notice that on balance, we are far freer than than any of the rest of the English-speaking world. Australia and New Zealand have been terrible.
What was it? Did you see the astronauts looking at the Earth meme, and it's the Earth tilted so it shows Australia, and the first astronaut says, "You mean it's always been a penal colony?" And the other astronaut just says, "Always has been," with a gun pointed at the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course in France and much of Europe, although not all. I think Hungary, Sweden. I think the Scandinavian countries have loosened up a bit.
Croatia, I'm pretty sure, also never locked down in any meaningful way.
So we have these principles of liberty, and we're benefiting from them, but we're not using them always as we ought. Now, I've got a question for. Let me ask Job, and then I want to hear what Carrie has to say. We talked a little bit about this, that the Bible does say a few things about freedom. There's the Greek word eleuth. I'm probably not saying it right. Job will know. Eleutheria. And then there's a word in Hebrew as well that's fairly common. But from my cursory look at the scriptures, freedom is extolled. I mean, freedom to do the right thing. But freedom is generally extolled in the Bible. And I don't know if there's ever been a book written on it, or a paper, or a thesis, but it would be interesting. But Job, can you or would you want to make the case that freedom in and of itself is a good thing? Now, obviously, it can be abused. We're not advocating libertinism, where you would do anything you want. That's not love of neighbor in any way. But freedom, if freedom has a PR company, they're not getting their money's worth. So, Job, what do you think of when you think of freedom relative to the Bible?
Well, the empires that are most known in the Bible are not exactly known for their belief in the allowing of people to flourish and prosper. They're often held up as tyrannical and wicked, and that wickedness is not limited to their hate of the Lord. It's for how they conduct themselves in other matters. And no, the Bible would press that people are meant to be free and to, yes, there is boundaries, but God gives room within the boundaries, and it's not as tight as people want to think it is. But we often have a problem of being pressed to give and to give up more than we're supposed to, and demanded that it's to do that. And I mean, how often we run into campaigns in churches of expectation of sacrificial giving. I don't know how that works together, but yet the Bible would call us to offer ourselves and to do things, and we do make sacrifices for other Christians. We have to be considerate. We do for civil society as well. But no, the Bible is. I'm almost hard pressed to ask, like, where do we come to think that the Bible would lend itself in any way to say, a heavy top-down state controlling the dress of people is just, that's really how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I tweeted a week or so, well, sometime in the last week. I think Resby really liked it, but it didn't get a lot of play. It's my experience that the best tweets or articles or whatever you ever write, they're not the most popular ones. But I said, live and let live is a Pauline doctrine. And I actually think it is. And I actually think that you might actually appeal to and have some influence with your neighbors that you might not otherwise have if you're concerned for their liberty. And if you don't try to, I mean, we want to evangelize, we want to be good examples, but we don't do it by coercion and force, and especially in this country or in the South, as Job will know, most people have been burned by this or that evangelistic association or method, or they've all seen things that just don't square with common sense. So I think it's not even, I think it's good for human flourishing. That's not just a Tim Keller word, to promote freedom. And some of our neighbors might appreciate that if we stand up, I think, for their freedom. What do you think about that, Carrie?
Yeah, well, I would say I think that Scripture talks about freedom and liberty and even rights all over the place. It doesn't necessarily use that lingo, but first of all, God holds us responsible, right? He holds us responsible for our lives, and if we are responsible for our lives, then that means we have a right to act out our lives in a responsible, God-honoring way. So, responsibility is the other side of the rights coin. And speaking of tweets, I had tweeted out earlier this morning that human rights they're not an American thing, right? This isn't just part of the American mythos. This is a human thing. And, we know that we have rights and freedoms because there are commands in Scripture that forbid theft, that forbid murder, that forbid rape, that forbid slavery. Those are very real commands, and that says something about the value of human beings generally, but also the value of human beings individually. And then the other thing that I want to talk about, because you mentioned sacrifice, we've mentioned charity, all of that is voluntary. Love is love is necessarily voluntary. As soon as you use force, it ceases to be love. In fact, people who try to manipulate love out of somebody is said to be emotionally abusive. So you cannot coerce loving action. You cannot coerce people to care, but we are called to voluntarily make these decisions. But that requires us to, reason through things, use the gifts that God has given us, and also take into account the fact that God has also called us to steward our own lives and our own bodies. And I think I said the last time I was on here, libertarianism has a principle of self-ownership, the idea that you own yourself. Lots of Christians sort of balk at that because we have a Bible verse that specifically says you do not own yourself. You are, bought by the blood of Christ. And so, the Christian perspective on that is that God gave me a stewardship over my life. So in relation to God, I'm a self-steward. But God didn't give stewardship of my life to Job or Resby or Gregory or anybody else.
Thank goodness not Resby.
So in relation
Real
to
Resbyterianism has never been tried.
But if you were to give it to someone, Resby would be a good one.
There you go.
Thank you.
So in relation to each other, we're self-owners, right? We own ourselves. And we are responsible for our lives. We're responsible for our lives before God, not just for taking care of ourselves and our own bodies, but for voluntarily demonstrating the love of Christ to our fellow neighbor. But all of that is necessarily voluntary. God doesn't even coerce us into loving him, right? The way that we love God is God loves us first. And that was a voluntary choice on his part as well. So I think freedom and rights and, all of this is just riddled throughout Scripture. And I guess the last thing that I would say is, and I'm forgetting the chapter, so maybe one of you can help me out here. But there's a chapter in Isaiah where Israel is clamoring for a king, and the prophet, what is it, Samuel is saying, look, if you get a king, they're going to conscript you, they're going to tax you, they're going to do all of these things to you. You don't want this. And that's a demonstration of the fact that, this idea of a monopolized government over Christians is not normative for Christians. Yes, we need to self-govern, and we can do that through a number of means. Yes, there is a role for civil governance, but that doesn't mean that it's the monopoly state. Monopoly state brings all kinds of hardship and violence upon us. So, I would say that to those people who are saying, look, this is the state, this is civil governance, God gave us civil governance, there's a distinction to be had there between the state and civil governance. It is not a given that the state is an absolute. Civil governance is certainly a gift from God, but the state is a usurper of good civil governance. And that seems demonstrably true, even as we speak right now.
Yeah, and we were warned, as you said, in that you said Isaiah, but you meant First Samuel.
I'm sorry, thank you.
Chapter 8, yeah, and someone else sent that to me, and I knew it was Chronicles or First Samuel. Right now, my wife and I are reading through either Chronicles or Kings. I think it's Kings. I can't remember. I know what's happening, but so I don't blame you for those the Chronicles, Kings, Samuel, and when they're with their overlapping narratives and their strange timelines can be a challenge.
Yeah.
So yeah, all those things are true. We if we look for the value of liberty in the Scripture, we can see it there.
Yes.
Job, what kind of questions have your congregants had for you along these lines?
Well,
or maybe they don't ever talk to you. Maybe they don't like you. I don't know.
Well, I don't think they like me, although I'm pretty sure one of them is in the chat right now. We'll let him determine if that's true. I think, honestly, the questions I've had have been very limited, but if they are, it's basically been, we're not going to start this mess again, are we? Mess is a good Southern word, and that's how things are summed up. We're not going to start this mess again. And
mess covers
really,
a multitude of sins.
Yeah, exactly. and it goes back to what we said all along, is like, we want to respect the right of each to make their own decision of how they want to do, mask or not mask, or seating to some extent. But we don't want to treat them like they are second class. So, that is a tricky, I should say. How do you treat each as if they are? We don't want to get in a situation where we're having separate seating in the congregation, where there's this group sits there and this group sits there. We've done that before, and that's bad. And
segregation is not good.
Right.
Not
And
good.
we don't want that on any account. We don't want the vaccinated, the non-vaccinated, the we should mask, we shouldn't. That can become difficult. And that's really the goal. And I've just said, I don't want to impose a mandate, or we will not impose a mandate, because if I can't tell you what you can wear pants or a skirt, I have no right to do that. I'm not given that permission by God. Therefore, I can't tell you to wear a mask or not a mask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So no questions really. Yeah, just the mess thing is the big one. Sorry.
Well, I would say, even so, my pastor out here at the Lutheran church that I've been attending, I think has handled that whole situation fairly well. And, in the beginning, it was, they had the official recommendation, and they emphasized recommendation, you wear a mask. But there was no, if you showed up without a mask, there was no treating you differently. There was no segregating you. There was no nothing. And if there was complaints about it, it was, look, he or she is free to make that decision before God. That's part of their Christian liberty. And eventually it came to a point where they just said, look, if you are worried about this, you can stay home. We are streaming services. We can give you grace there, but we're not going to segregate the church. We're not going to, we're not going to create these rules that create an internal caste system. And so it was a lot of respecting Christian liberty. It was a lot of saying this isn't the role of the church. They did take away fellowship meals, so there was a little bit of give and take on both sides. But when it came down to individual decisions about what people put on in their bodies, that's a matter of Christian liberty. We can't, we're not going to say one way or the other whether that should be done. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying, look, if you are genuinely fearful about this, or better, well stated, if you have a particular vulnerability that makes you feel like you need to stay home. I mean, in some sense, yes, thank God we have the technology to be able to stream services.
And we actually said that, I think, in one of our COVID episodes, is like that's one of the good things out of the pandemic, and when we were when everyone was still mostly doing stuff virtually and just like getting back to talking about meeting back in person. I think it was Chortles who said it, is there are some people who will want to come where you might say maybe you should stay back just a couple 2 more weeks, as it all kind of cycles through.
It was our oldest members who were the first back. But I heard somebody on the Irreverend. We're going to have some of those guys on again next week. They said old people are telling us we want to live until we die.
Yeah.
And they part of that, part of living for them as a Christian was to come to church, and they didn't care. But that's not to say that everyone has to take that view of it.
Right. I think that there's something to be said about us revisiting and getting ourselves, familiarized once again with the sections of the confessions that talk about Christian liberty and freedom of conscience. God gave us those gifts, and everything about the Christian life is making good decisions for ourselves and making good decisions for others. But nothing is, you don't have a list of prescriptions, right? Like even the fruits of the spirit are very general, self-control, that can be applied anywhere. It doesn't say, you have to only drink one beer a night, no more than that. Like it doesn't say that. It says exercise self-control, which leaves a measure of decision making to the individual.
Well, that was my point earlier of Carrie's, that what you're saying is that's how many Christians grew up and still want. I mean, it's not uncommon to get, not just because I'm a pastor, but hey, pastor, or mature Christian, what do I need to do in this exact specific situation? And we need to ask questions of wisdom. There is no wisdom in modern American church, but it's often put aside for just tell me what to do.
Right.
And just tell me exactly what to do. And that's just not how most things are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should say that the grace that we need in all this goes both ways. If I don't agree with the rest of the 6 or 7 elders I served with, it's my job to try to get along and support them and present a good united front and keep the peace. It's also a very good thing if our members who are on one extreme or the other on these issues are trying to be as understanding as possible and prefer others to themselves. You can take that doctrine and beat people over the head with it, but we can all moderate a bit on this, and but preserve the liberty of others. It's not easy. I think my church has done extremely well through all this. It's not to say everybody was happy. In fact, I think at one time nobody was happy on either extreme, which might mean we were doing the right thing, or it might mean that we were doing exactly the wrong thing.
Well, didn't you write an email to the church that basically made everyone more confused and angry than they were before you sent it?
I tried. Yes, we sent it. I did. I sent an email for the session, and we thought everyone was going to love it.
Did
you know that writers at the Gospel Coalition think that same thing every time before they send it off?
Yeah, Joe Carter probably thinks every one of those things, all 9 of them, are going to be gold, Jerry, gold. But there's been a lot of misunderstanding, and hopefully it's not based on suspicion, just normal human frailty and sin on both sides. And that's not to say that sin's no big deal, but it's our natural state now. And again, even if you become a real Lutheran, Carrie, the Reformed doctrine of total depravity is very helpful. Yes. It's very good at curbing your enthusiasm and adjusting your expectations, and it ought to lead you not to hate everybody, but to give them the benefit of the doubt and as much patience as you can muster. So,
and I want to say, if I may, I teach online courses in learning to think well. We typically think of that as critical thinking, but it's not quite the same as most critical thinking courses. But at any rate, I teach these courses in learning how to think well, and I think it's important for Christians in particular to understand, because one of the unintended consequences, shall we say, of all these things sort of coming to a head is the fact that pastors across the world were but particularly in America, I suppose, were inundated with all kinds of responses from their congregants, and there was no way for them to win. And that is a ton of pressure. I'm like, I didn't pressure my pastor for anything because I knew that, you know, he was getting it from both sides. But one way that we as Christians can love our pastors is by learning to think through these things for ourselves and not constantly wanting them to be our brain for us. You know, God created us to be thinking creatures. That's one of the unique attributes of human beings that make us distinct from animals, is our ability to reason and think through things. But it's a skill. It's a skill that has to be learned and practiced. And you can't have somebody else doing the thinking for you. And we have a lot of people who are expecting pastors to do the thinking for them, politicians to do the thinking for them, medical professionals to do the thinking for them. And really, if you want to get down to brass tacks, what needs to happen here is people need to start thinking for themselves. And that doesn't guarantee that you're going to be right. It doesn't mean that you're going to make the best decisions, but you can't put that kind of pressure on other people who are not equipped. God did not design all these other professions to make the decisions for you.
If I can press back just for a second, there are some pastors that do want to do the thinking for you. So that is one of the problems. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that you're right, but the problem is their members will run into is that pastors, there's a lot of times they want to make these decisions, and that's why sometimes they go to great lengths to make videos and descriptions. And, you know, a lot of I was just thinking earlier, talking about the advertising of it, how often it felt like an evangelical financial campaign. They've often felt like that because they're wanting to get they're wanting to sell this to be a certain way. So, members think for yourself, but for pastors, give members the room and the freedom to think for themselves and help in that, and know that they might not come to the same conclusion you do.
Yeah. The job of pastors is to preach the gospel, is to administer word and sacrament, keep it simple. Don't try. I mean, I would even say that for the pastors who got up there, you know, trying to make a political statement on either side of this issue, right? Your job is word and sacrament. That's it.
Yeah, but when John MacArthur stepped up there, they gave him a 5-minute standing ovation. So there was that. I mean, he got his reward.
Such a celebrity, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, Free XJC, we've muted him because his audio was so bad. But let's see if and the computer, otherwise known as
it's funny that's his actual real voice.
I'm sorry. Ooh.
A lot of people don't realize that.
Well, I don't know if that's human flourishing, but Free, anything to say before we wind up?
No, this is Appalachian internet and technology at its best right here. So, I'm just amazed at the fact that we've talked for over and Romans 13 has not been mentioned to us libertarians. But that's okay. There's a lot of reading in the chat for that. So, but it's been a joy to be on with you guys.
All right,
I think we should acknowledge, though, that Free's internet may be the greatest argument against libertarianism at this point.
Well, now, so if you go to, it's the Libertarian Christian Institute, libertarianchristians.com, you can't go there without getting offered a paper on Romans 13 because they know that's the first objection that most conservative Protestants are going to have. So if you go to libertarianchristians.com, and I think you maybe have to give them your email address, they'll send you their take on that, and that would be a show in itself. So I didn't really want to get into that too heavily, although it might have been very, very helpful. I mean, really, we're not here to solve anything. We're just here to help people. Well, I think we're to divert guys for an hour and a half on a weeknight so their wives can have some peace. I think that's what our role is.
I just want to add to that thing about the Libertarian Christian Institute. Gregory Baus does have an article about a reformed view of Romans 13. So that's really easy to find if you just go to their website, search Gregory Baus, or Reformed Romans 13. I'm sure that you can find it. You can also find the same article on my website at mereliberty.com/Romans 13. But Gregory really gave that a good Reformed treatment, because there's several different ways of looking at Romans 13 from different theological perspectives. But we all know that the Reformed like their unique nuances. So Gregory did that for you guys.
Yeah, and I think some people kind of use Romans 13 as a cop-out. Well, I don't have to think about this anymore. I just have to submit. But I think we all agree it's not quite that simple. And we don't have to be, again, Doug Wilson or Christian Reconstructionist or Covenanters with a gun on our belt to consider these things and to have an opinion about them. Well, thanks, Carrie, for joining us.
You're welcome.
Again,
thank you for having me.
People can easily find you. You are at Mere Liberty on Twitter.
Yep.
A lot of our listeners are there. The name of the Facebook group of which I'm a part, is it just called Christian Libertarians?
So LCI has a Facebook group called Christian Libertarians, and then there's also a Reformed Libertarianism group.
I think that may be what I'm on. I'm not sure.
And so if you're a little nervous about the anarchism, Reformed Libertarianism is a great place for small government types. But if you are curious, there's also the Reformed Anarchism group, which Gregory and I admin.
Yeah, so we won't get into minarchism versus anarchism. Because we won't do that.
Stay tuned for the second half of the show coming up in 10 minutes.
Yeah, that would be a long night there.
Yeah.
And we would be refugees from ecclesial justice for sure if that went on for too long. Right. Joe, we're glad you were with us because you provided some good real world perspective, and appreciate everyone. So we'll let Resby do his thing and tell everyone good night, and thank everyone, and whatever, plug his latest book or whatever he wants to do.
Come on, I can barely read a book, let alone write one.
I was trying to compliment you.
It's all right. I want to be known as a truth teller. All right, straight talk. So thank you guys, everyone, for either listening if you're in your car on the long road to freedom, like our intro music says. We love doing the show. Thank you to Carrie and Job and Free and Baus. Unfortunately, he couldn't really come on, but this has been a lot of fun. I don't think anyone actually said the phrase, so I'm going to work it into my closing. It's your body, your choice. We just ask that you not use yours to be an Erdman.
Magic on the internet worldwide.